the most powerful battleship in the world. 8 days at sea. That was all the operational career she ever had. And the thing that sealed her fate was a torpedo from a swordfish. Now, let us take a step back from the drama of those individual moments and think about the larger picture. Because there are several layers to this story that deserve deeper examination. The first layer is the question of why Germany's modern battleship, bristling with anti-aircraft weapons and sophisticated fire control technology, failed to shoot down a single one of those ancient biplanes. The popular explanation, the one you will read in almost every popular account of the battle, is that the swordfish were simply too slow for Bismarck's targeting systems to track. The fire control computers, which used a combination of optical rangefinders, early radar, and mechanical calculation, were designed to solve a particular problem: how to hit a fast-moving aircraft. When you fire at a moving target, you cannot aim where the target is. You have to aim where the target is going to be by the time your shell gets there. This is called lead or deflection. Getting it right requires knowing the target's speed and direction with some precision. Modern aircraft of 1941 flew at 200, 250, 300 miles per hour. Bismarck's fire control was calibrated around those kinds of speeds. When the swordfish came in at 85 to 90 miles per hour, the system was computing a lead that was far too large. The shells were going to where a fast aircraft would have been, not to where a slow biplane actually was. The swordfish were flying into the gap between where the computer said they should be and where they actually were. Some historians have pushed back against this explanation. They point out, quite reasonably, that Germany would have been insane to design a fire control system that could not engage slow aircraft, since virtually all torpedo bombers of the late 1930s were relatively slow. They note that Bismarck's own guns fired when the ship was completing construction in 1940 and may have damaged some of the more sensitive components of the fire control system. They point to the atrocious weather conditions, near darkness, heavy seas, poor visibility. They point to the fact that the swordfish attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the gunners to constantly swing their weapons and lose their tracking solutions. They note that Bismarck was maneuvering violently to avoid the torpedoes, making stable gunnery almost impossible. All of these factors were real. The truth is probably that all of them contributed. The targeting problem with slow aircraft may have been a genuine technical limitation. The weather and the maneuvering and the simultaneous attacks from multiple angles certainly made things worse. Whatever the exact combination of reasons, the result was the same. Bismarck could not hit the swordfish. Not a single one. There is also a structural problem with Bismarck's anti-aircraft armament that historians have pointed out. Her heavy anti-aircraft guns, the 10.5 centimeter weapons, were actually fitted with two different types of fire control director due to shortages of the preferred design. The two types were not fully integrated or synchronized with each other. The training of the anti-aircraft crews had been incomplete when she sailed, because inspections had been cut short and equipment was still being installed. Some of the gun positions had limited arcs of fire because of how they had been sighted on the ship. None of Bismarck's guns had radar-laid fire control, and the directors lacked stabilization systems that might have helped compensate for the ship's rolling in heavy seas. In other words, Bismarck's anti-aircraft defense was not nearly as formidable as it appeared on paper. She was a magnificent ship, but she sailed before she was fully ready, before her crew was fully trained, and with a fire control system that had not been properly integrated or tested. The consequences were fatal. The second layer of this story is what the swordfish's success reveals about the nature of technological advantage in warfare. The German Navy, and indeed much of the German military establishment, had placed enormous faith in the principle of technological superiority. The Bismarck was the expression of that faith. She was the latest in metallurgy, armor, propulsion, and gunnery. She represented the best that German engineering could produce. And she was beaten by an aircraft that predated her by nearly a decade. There is a lesson there that military planners have been grappling with ever since. Modern, sophisticated weapon systems are often optimized for specific threats. They are designed to defeat specific kinds of attacks. And when an attack comes from an unexpected quarter, using an unexpected method, a sophisticated system can fail completely while a simpler, more robust system succeeds. The swordfish had no sophisticated electronics to be jammed. It had no complex hydraulic systems to fail. It was simple, reliable, and capable of operating in conditions that would have grounded more advanced aircraft. And in the North Atlantic in May 1941, those qualities mattered more than speed or modernity. The third layer of the story is the human one. Because behind every aircraft, every torpedo, every ship, every statistic, there were human beings making decisions and paying prices. Think about what the Swordfish crews went through that evening. They had already made one catastrophic mistake, attacking their own ship. They had landed back on a carrier deck that was heaving in a storm. They had been told they were going out again. They knew they were flying at a battleship. They knew what battleships did to aircraft. They had seen HMS Hood explode and sink. And they climbed back into their open cockpits in the cold and the dark and the spray, and they went back out. The bravery of those men is almost incomprehensible. They were not suicidal. They were not reckless. They were professional naval aviators doing an extraordinarily dangerous job. One of the Swordfish pilots described the approach to Bismarck as emerging from the clouds and finding the ship firing everything she had directly at them. They were already committed. They pressed on. One aircraft had its nose lifted by the explosion of a shell detonating in the water beneath it and was carried upward bodily by the waterspout before falling back into level flight. The crew continued their attack. Another aircraft returned to Ark Royal with, as I mentioned, 175 holes counted in the fabric. The observer in that aircraft was wounded. The pilot was wounded. They both flew home. The man who is most often credited with the decisive torpedo hit, the one that jammed Bismarck's rudder, is Sublieutenant John Moffett of 818 Naval Air Squadron. He was 22 years old at the time. In the chaos of the attack, in the dark, in the storm, under fire, he made his approach, held his nerve, and at the right moment released his torpedo. That torpedo, traveling through the stormy water of the North Atlantic, struck Bismarck in exactly the right place. And everything that followed flowed from that single event. Moffett lived to be 97 years old. He wrote a memoir about his experiences called I Sank the Bismarck. He was always modest about his role, acknowledging that in the chaos of the attack it was difficult to know with certainty whose torpedo had struck where. But the evidence pointed strongly to him. He died in 2016, one of the last living links to that extraordinary night. Let us also think for a moment about the men on Bismarck. Over 2,200 men sailed on that ship. Most of them were young. Most of them were simply doing their duty, the same way the Swordfish crews were doing theirs. The horror of Bismarck's final hours, of a great ship being slowly destroyed around her crew, of men burning and drowning and fighting on with no hope of survival, is a tragedy that should not be forgotten even as we celebrate the Swordfish's achievement. War does not produce only heroes, produces mostly victims. Now, there is another remarkable dimension to this story that often gets overlooked in popular accounts, and that is the role of the Swordfish before and after the Bismarck action. Before the attack on Bismarck, the Swordfish had already made history at Taranto. In November 1940, 21 Swordfish from HMS Illustrious attacked the Italian fleet at anchor in Taranto harbor. Flying in two waves in the dark, they penetrated the harbor defenses, dropped their torpedoes in shallow water, and devastated the Italian battle fleet. The battleship Conte di Cavour was sunk outright and never returned to service. The Caio Duilio and the Littorio were badly damaged and put out of action for months. 3 aircraft were lost. It remains one of the most tactically efficient airstrikes of the entire war. And after Bismarck, the Swordfish kept going. By 1942, they were being transferred off the large fleet carriers as newer aircraft came into service. But they were given an equally important and arguably even more difficult job: anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. Armed with radar, rockets, and depth charges, operating off small escort carriers, Swordfish hunted German U-boats across the brutal waters of the Atlantic. They flew in weather that grounded other aircraft. They operated in darkness and in storms. They were credited with sinking or contributing to the destruction of 14 German submarines. In 1942, 6 Swordfish made one of the most heroic and tragic attacks of the entire war, during what became known as the Channel Dash. The German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with Prinz Eugen, made a bold dash up the English Channel in broad daylight. 6 Swordfish from 825 Naval Air Squadron, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, who had led one of the attacks on Bismarck the previous year, were sent against them. They had been promised a fighter escort that never fully materialized. They attacked anyway. They flew into a storm of anti-aircraft fire and German fighters. Not a single aircraft returned. Esmond himself was shot down and killed. All 6 aircraft were destroyed. 13 of the 18 crew members died. 5 survivors were pulled from the channel. It was an act of collective bravery that defies any attempt to properly describe it. Esmond was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. The other crew members received various decorations. British Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay wrote that in his opinion, the attack of those 6 swordfish constituted one of the finest exhibitions of self-sacrifice and devotion to duty the war had ever witnessed. Remarkably, even the German commander, Vice Admiral Otto Ciliax, called it the mothball attack of a handful of ancient planes, piloted by men whose bravery surpasses any other action by either side that day. Think about that. The German admiral they were trying to kill paid tribute to the bravery of the men attacking him. That is the measure of what those crews did. The swordfish continued flying until January 1945. Nearly 2,400 of them were built. 9 frontline squadrons were still flying them in the final months of the war. They outlasted the aircraft that was specifically designed to replace them, the Fairey Albacore, which proved less effective in service and was withdrawn earlier. The Swordfish, designed in 1933, was still flying combat missions when Germany surrendered in May 1945. Now let us zoom out even further and consider the strategic consequences of what happened in May 1941. Bismarck was intended to be the first of a new kind of threat. She was supposed to demonstrate that surface raiders could break into the Atlantic and wreak havoc on the convoy routes. If she had succeeded, and if her success had encouraged the Germans to send more heavy ships into the Atlantic, the consequences for Britain could have been severe. The German Navy was already planning to use heavy ships in the Atlantic in conjunction with the U-boat campaign. A successful Bismarck operation might have provided the political impetus to pursue that strategy more aggressively. Instead, Bismarck's destruction, particularly the circumstances of it, had the opposite effect. The Führer himself was deeply disturbed by the loss of such a prestigious ship. He met with Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, and expressed his concerns in the strongest terms. From that point on, Hitler became increasingly reluctant to risk his remaining heavy ships in offensive operations. The Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship and an equally powerful battleship, spent most of the rest of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords. She did relatively little actual fighting. She was bombed by RAF Lancaster bombers, attacked by British midget submarines, and eventually sunk in November 1944, still without having fired her main guns at an enemy surface ship in anger. The mere existence of the Tirpitz tied down substantial British naval forces that had to be available to respond if she ever did come out. But she never really did. The other German heavy ships, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Prinz Eugen, and the pocket battleships, all became increasingly cautious after Bismarck. The surface raider strategy that had been Germany's great hope for cutting off Britain's lifeline was effectively abandoned. The war at sea would be won or lost in the submarine battle, the Battle of the Atlantic, not in clashes between surface ships. And so the consequences of that torpedo from a Swordfish biplane, flying at 90 miles per hour in a North Atlantic storm in the growing darkness of May 26, 1941, stretched far beyond the sinking of a single ship. They shaped the entire German naval strategy for the rest of the war. But let us come back to the Swordfish itself one more time, because there is something philosophically fascinating about this aircraft and what it represents. The Swordfish is often held up as an example of the value of simplicity in a complex world. In an era when aviation technology was advancing at breathtaking speed, when engineers were racing to produce faster, higher-flying, better-armed aircraft with sophisticated new systems, the Swordfish was left behind. It was too slow, too old, too unsophisticated. And yet, it kept finding ways to make itself indispensable. It could operate in weather that grounded more modern aircraft because its simple construction and low landing speed made it controllable in conditions that would have made a faster aircraft impossible to land safely on a carrier deck. It could carry an extraordinary variety of weapons and equipment because its design was flexible enough to be modified without requiring a complete redesign. It was easy to maintain, even on a carrier deck in the middle of the ocean, because there was nothing unnecessarily complicated about it. And its crews, who knew the aircraft's limitations intimately, had learned to work within those limitations and sometimes to turn them into advantages. There is a lesson there that goes beyond aviation and beyond military history. In any technical field, in any competitive environment, the newest and most sophisticated solution is not always the best solution. Sometimes the simple, reliable, flexible option that has been around long enough to have all its problems worked out is more effective than the cutting-edge alternative. The Swordfish did not win at Taranto and did not cripple Bismarck because it was a superior aircraft. It won because the people flying it were extraordinarily skilled and brave, because they understood how to use it, and because circumstances aligned in ways that allowed its particular combination of qualities to make the decisive difference. There is also something to be said about the courage of institutional faith. In 1941, the Fleet Air Arm was still flying Swordfish when every other major navy had moved on to monoplane torpedo bombers. The Americans had the Douglas TBD Devastator. The Japanese had the Nakajima B-5N, the Kate, which was considerably faster and more modern. British planners knew the Swordfish was outdated. And yet they used it because it was what they had, because their crews knew it, and because events like Taranto kept demonstrating that in the right circumstances, in the right hands, it could still produce results that more modern aircraft had failed to achieve. The men of the Fleet Air Arm never asked to fly an obsolete biplane into the face of the most powerful surface weapons in the world. They did not compare their aircraft to what the Americans or Japanese were flying and ask for something better before they would take off. They flew what they had, with everything they had, and they accomplished something that remains almost incredible even now, more than 80 years later. The wreck of Bismarck lies today at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, in approximately 15,700 feet of water, about 650 miles west of Brest. She was discovered by the oceanographer Robert Ballard in 1989. The wreck shows signs of both torpedo damage and internal explosions, and the question of whether Bismarck was ultimately sunk by British torpedoes or scuttled by her own crew remains a subject of debate among historians and naval engineers. The Germans themselves opened the seacocks and detonated scuttling charges in her final minutes, and it is possible that she sank at least partly as a result of those deliberate actions rather than solely from British weapons. But regardless of the precise cause of her sinking, she was stopped, crippled, and prevented from escaping by those Swordfish torpedoes. Without them, she would have reached France. Without them, she would have returned to sea. The Bismarck is also remembered as a symbol of the cost of hubris, of the danger of believing too strongly in one's own power and invincibility. She was called unsinkable. She was regarded as the ultimate expression of naval might. And she was beaten by fabric-covered biplanes that would have looked at home in a museum exhibit about the First World War. Military history is full of such moments. Moments when the seemingly inevitable does not happen, when the side with more firepower and more technology loses to the side with more ingenuity and more courage. The Swordfish and Bismarck is one of the most vivid examples of this pattern in the entire history of warfare. As we close out this story, I want to leave you with a few final thoughts. The ferry Swordfish is not well remembered outside of naval history circles. Most people who are not enthusiasts of this period have never heard of it. It has no Hollywood film dedicated to it, no massive public memorials. It sits in a handful of museums, lovingly preserved by volunteers who understand what it represents. There is one airworthy example, maintained by the Royal Navy Historic Flight in Britain, which still flies at airshows on occasion. When it appears at events, it is always met with a kind of confused admiration, because it looks so impossibly ancient, so impossibly fragile, so completely wrong for the role it performed. And yet there it is. The men who flew it are almost all gone now. The youngest would be well over 100 years old. Their stories survive in memoirs, in official records, in the interviews that oral historians and documentary filmmakers conducted while there was still time. John Moffat's memoir is there for anyone who wants to read it. The records of the Fleet Air Arm squadrons are preserved in archives. The testimony of survivors from both sides of the Bismarck battle has been collected and analyzed. The history is there. The lesson is there. What that lesson is, I think, is this: do not underestimate the wrong enemy. Do not assume that your technology has solved every problem. Do not assume that the weapon pointed at you is too primitive to matter. And do not assume that courage has a speed limit. The swordfish flew at 90 miles per hour, and it changed the world. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you found this story as remarkable as I do, please share it with someone who loves history. Subscribe if you have not already, because there are more stories like this one, stories that are just as extraordinary, just as human, and just as important. And leave a comment below. I genuinely want to know what part of this story struck you most. Was it the attack itself? The mystery of why Bismarck could not shoot down those biplanes? The bravery of those crews in the Channel Dash? The sheer improbability of all of it? Because in a world that sometimes feels like it moves too fast for meaning, there is something deeply comforting about the story of a slow, old, fabric-covered biplane, flying into the fire and winning.